Good afternoon. This will be the last part in my trilogy about Tower Hamlets Cemetery. And will it be the best of three? Who knows? But this episode is going to be about 11 different Lechmere family graves, all from the characters who are in the period of the Jack the Ripper murders. I'm going to go through chronologically from the first graves to the last, and the first one I'm going to show you is that of Emily Charlotte Lechmere, Charles Lechmere's sister, who died in July 1869 and was buried just in here. This is square 54, but the graves in the plot which I'm going to show you were listed as K. Oh, God, won't go through that way. I'll come around this way. So these were the private graves, and the K graves were public graves. And she was in K 63, which was about here. And all this area with a K, public graves K, all this open area. No standing gravestones at all, but she was buried about here. I can gauge it by the numbers on the stones here. And there's obviously nothing to be seen. Although there are quite a lot of gravestones and bits of gravestones on the ground here. Whether they belong, you look at these here, whether they belong to the public graves here, I don't know. If this area is excavated, we might conceivably find her gravestone, or may well not. The significant thing about Lechmere's sister Emily Charlotte is that she was buried and lived under the name Lechmere. Throughout her life, she died young of what we'd call TB now, and during the life of her bigamous stepfather, Thomas Cross, she carried on calling herself Lechmere. This is Emily Lechmere's cemetery record showing her grave K63. And here is Emily Lechmere's death certificate, which contains some very significant information. As I said, she is called Lechmere. I highlighted this because her stepfather, Thomas Cross, was alive and living with her mother, Maria, and this shows she had not adopted her stepfather's name. This is significant because there are claims that during the marriage between her mother and Thomas Cross, the children would have gone under the name Cross and not Lechmere, the name of Maria's first husband and their biological father. Interestingly, it incorrectly gives the Christian name, the first name of her father, as Charles Lechmere instead of John Lechmere, which was the right thing. And I'll come back to that interesting error shortly. It says that she died of phthisis, which we would call TB. She lived at Mary Ann Street, and the witness was Mary Ann Marshall. Mary Ann Street was very close to and midway between Pinchin Street, where a torso was found in September 1889, and Burner Street, where Liz Stride was murdered in September 1888. Her mother Maria was living in Mary Ann Street in 1888 and 1889. It was discovered fairly recently by a researcher called Gary Barnett that Mary Ann Marshall's husband was one of the key witnesses who saw Liz Stride on Burner Street immediately before she was murdered. A month after Emily's death, her stepfather, Thomas Cross, fell ill and had to take time off work. He was a local Whitechapel policeman with collar number H50. On the 27th of August, he was summoned to a sick parade in front of the surgeon at Scotland Yard. The daily police orders show that he had to appear at similar parades on multiple occasions, sometimes with a surgeon, sometimes with a chief surgeon. Clearly, the Metropolitan Police did not tolerate malingerers. He was last called to a parade in front of the surgeon on the 17th of December at 2:30 p.m, but I'm not sure that he attended. The next day, PC H50 Thomas Cross died. There was no pension at that time, but they arranged a voluntary subscription, but I don't know how much it raised for his widow Maria. The police records show that his warrant number was 36207 and that he died of dropsy. So from Emily Lechmere's grave in July 1869, we're moving on to December 1869. Same square, not surprisingly, 54. Same area, burial area K, which was all this wide area. This time it's Thomas Cross, the bigamous stepfather of Emily and Charles Lechmere. I was going to say Charles Cross for a minute then. Charles Lechmere. He's buried about here in K175. Here is Thomas Cross's cemetery record, his grave number being K175, and his death certificate, which says he was 34 and died of dropsy, from which he was suffering for 5 months, which agrees with his police record. Dropsy was what they used to call a swelling of the body due to fluid retention, and was probably due to heart disease. He also suffered from uremia, which is kidney failure. On the subject of Thomas Cross, I'll show you his marriage certificate to Maria. She was Maria Lechmere at the time, from 1858. Maria declared that she was a widow, which of course implies that her first husband, John Allen Lechmere, was dead, although this was a lie, and he was very much alive and living in Daventry. PC Thomas Cross was only 23 at the time, which agrees with his age at death, 34, 11 years later. And Maria is 32, 9 years older than him. It was a registry office wedding rather than in a church. Clearly, this was a bigamous marriage. I will now show you the 1861 census for this family. It's slightly fuzzy, I'm afraid. Emily Lechmere is down as Emily Cross, age 14, just as Charles Lechmere is listed as Charles Cross, aged 11. Clearly, as children, they didn't fill out the return given to the census enumerator themselves. The most likely person to do that was the bigamous stepfather, who called them Cross, probably to save explanation or embarrassment. This is almost certainly why he also lied about his age, saying that he was 36 instead of 26, as otherwise he would not have been old enough to have been the father for these children. For a bigamously married policeman, the less questions raised, the better. Also, while I'm talking about the 1861 census, the family was living at Thomas Street, which in the 1880s was renamed Pinchin Street. Yes, they were living in the same street where that torso was dumped in 1889. Incorrect information on records pertaining to Thomas Cross was a habit, with the emphasis clearly on avoiding leaving a paper trail that pointed to his bigamy. Maria was listed as a widow on the marriage certificate. Emily's father's name was given as Charles and not John on her death certificate. Thomas Cross lied about his age on the census by 10 years, and he called the children Cross and not Lechmere, also on that same census. It all fits together with a pattern of subterfuge and argues against any habitual use of the name Cross by either Emily or Charles. This puts into perspective Charles Lechmere's use of the name Cross at the inquest into the murder of Polly Nichols. So I don't believe there's any significance in Emily Lechmere and Thomas Cross's grave being in the same vicinity, because they're only buried a few months apart, and clearly this area K was the area that was being used at that time. The next grave I'm going to show is also in K, and it's for a guy called Thomas Bay Bostock, who was the father-in-law of Charles Lechmere. He was a lighterman who worked on the River Thames, knew the tides, knew the ways of the river, and he has some significance to this story as well. Up to his death, he lived in Wapping, very close to the river. Thomas Bay Bostock is the only one whose grave I can't precisely identify because it's not on the map. Something I'll come on to later on. This churchyard, unlike the rest of the magnificent 7 cemeteries, very early on became, not to say a dumping ground, but they didn't keep the records up properly with any sort of precision. And this whole area of the K graves, most of the graves within K aren't numbered. You can work out what the numbers are because there's a gap in the numbering. They do one number there, count the graves, and that's what the numbers are in between. But they got out of the habit in this cemetery quite early on for keeping the records of any sort of detail. It was very higgledy-piggledy, and it was a sort of a class-based thing, I'm sure. They couldn't be bothered. But we'll come on to that a bit later on. Here is Thomas Bay Bostock's cemetery record showing that he was buried in K872 and also that he lived in Lower Gun Alley where he died in 1876. This is the address where the Bostocks were living when Charles Lechmere was courting their daughter Elizabeth. It's Lower Gun Alley is about 100 yards from the River Thames in Wapping. If we take a look at Lechmere's marriage certificate with his daughter from 1870, we see that Thomas Bay Bostock was a lighterman by profession, as I mentioned, and so would have been familiar with the tides and ways of the river. Incidentally, the first of the Thames torso murders, known as the Battersea Mystery, occurred in 1873, and some of the body parts washed up on the shore not a million miles away from Wapping. This is the area of the K graves. We have Dr. Llewellyn's grave here, which we saw on the first film about Tower Hamlets Cemetery. Jamrach's grave, which we saw in the same film about Tower Hamlets Cemetery. The second film about Tower Hamlets Cemetery was mainly about Rose Milet, and that's her grave there. And K is between it. It's surrounded by these 3 rows of private graves, and in the middle were the common graves K. And this is the only part of the cemetery where we find K graves with the prefix K. So we come in close, we can see the first one I showed you, Emily Charlotte Lechmere's grave, K63, and Thomas Cross's grave, quite close by, K175. I don't believe there's any sentimental reason why they were so close together. I think it's because they're both buried in 1869, and that's when this part of the cemetery was being dug. A few years later, Thomas Bay Bostock was buried in K872. Now there's no K872 mentioned here. That's because they were very sloppy at record keeping in Tower Hamlets Cemetery. If we look at these numbers here, there's no numbers here, but if you look at the number here and look at the number here, we can judge what the intervening numbers are. They stopped doing that even, and over here there's just a load of empty graves. And it's going to be one of these, or perhaps filled in around the edge, where Thomas Bay Bostock was buried, because nowhere else in the cemetery do we find K graves apart from within this area. Now, I'm not sticking to the exactly correct chronology here. I'm going to show you the grave. This is where roughly the grave of Susannah Bostock, the wife of Thomas Bay Bostock, was. She died quite a few years later, 1889. In an area called, the graves here are all D, most of them here are D, there are other letters mixed in as well, but it's mostly D, and she, as I said, it's square 20, the area of the graves, the prefix is D, and she's buried here. She was grave 543. The other grave in D, which is actually in square 19, was slightly more over this way, was Charles Lechmere's second bigamous stepfather. And as I say, I'll probably do another episode on the issue of the bigamy that his mother Maria entered into twice. So a guy called Joseph Fosdyke, he died in 1889 as well, and that's probably again why they're both buried in this same general area. Joseph Fosdyke, He's D663. He died in December 1889. And one of the significant factors of his death, round about here I think he was buried, one of the significant factors of Joseph Fosdyke's death is that he was ill when the Pinchin Street torso was dumped very close to his house, the house he shared with Lechmere's mother, Maria, and Lechmere's mother, we know, had a cat's meat business. And so there's connections to the Pinchin Street torso there. That's the significance of Joseph Fosdyke's death and his burial around here. Here is Susannah Bostock's cemetery record showing grave D543 in February 1889 and Joseph Fosdyke's, who was buried in D663 in December 1889. He had spent that year in the workhouse and has been where he was described as destitute, which seems strange as his wife, Maria, had opened up a cat's meat business at least around that time, so she must have had some capital. On his death certificate, it shows his address as being 147 Cable Street, yes, which is just around the corner from Pinchin Street. He died from senility. He was 10 years older than Maria and was her second bigamous husband. Joseph Fosdyke's absences and illnesses in 1889 probably explains why the Pinchin Street torso had to be dumped quickly and by hand from its storage site. So next we're going to show you on the map where the D graves are. Here is the Dissenters' Chapel. Then we have private graves, and in the middle we have D. It's not only D. If we come in, we can see there are other letters around here, rather confusingly, but most of these around here are D. And we have Joseph Fosdyke, D663, and Susannah, who was the bigamous husband of Lechmere's mother, and Susannah Bostock, D543, who was Lechmere's mother-in-law. Now again, these two were both buried in 1889, and that's why they've got reasonable proximity, because clearly this was the area that was being used around 1889. Now behind me is the southern gate into Tower Hamlets Cemetery. This area was all destroyed in that thing I keep going on about in 1967 by the GLC. We're in square 93. The graves are D, and round about here was grave 977, and this is where Charles Allen Lechmere was buried. But before you get too excited, it's not Charles Allen Lechmere, also known as Charles Cross, it's his son, his firstborn son, who died in 1875 and was buried around about here. Now, the name Charles Allen Lechmere was clearly very important to Charles Allen Lechmere. Not only did he name his first son that, after his first son died, his eighth son later was also called Charles Allen Lechmere. Here is Charles Allen Lechmere Jr, the son, his cemetery record from January 1885 showing grave 977L, not D, as I slipped up with saying just now. He was just 2 years old, almost 3. And here is his baptism from 1872. As I said, Charles Allen Lechmere's 8th child reused the same name and was baptised in 1884. Clearly, the name Charles Allen Lechmere was very important to Charles Allen Lechmere, having 2 children named that. This is Charles Lechmere Jr.'s grave, 977L, in the very bottom part of the cemetery, where the path here led out to the exit. Now we're going to find the grave, or the location roughly of the grave of Harriet Emma Lechmere, his 10th child, who died in October 1890. He had a subsequent child also called Harriet Emma. So again, Harriet Emma was obviously an important name. Harriet was the name of one of his family names of one of his aunts. So it was obviously important to him. She died, she's buried in grave R5, square 32, which is here. Another one of these squares which has pretty much been desecrated. There's one or two graves about, but it's pretty much been desecrated by the Greater London Council back in 1967. And the interesting thing about Harriet Emma Lechmere is that she was born in 1888, the year of the Ripper murders. Before the Ripper murders happened, before he moved to Doveton Street, he lived, which was on the route that took him past all the murder scenes, he lived in a place called James Street, which was further south, and that was where, until June of 1888, and that is where they were living when she was born. And she probably, well, I suspect, was a sickly child. Let's say she died 2 years later. The interesting thing, obviously, she was christened as Lechmere. She was put in as a birth record as Lechmere. They're two of the records from 1888 when Lechmere called himself Lechmere. This is Harriet Emma Lechmere's grave record R5. She was born in January 1888 and baptised before the family moved from James Street to Doveton Street in that year, in June of that year in fact. She was the family's 10th child. Their 11th and last child was also called Harriet Emma Lechmere and was born in March 1891. Charles Lechmere had two Lechmere aunts who lived in London, one called Harriet, one called Emma, and the fact that he was very particular about calling this child Harriet Emma Lechmere, that the first one died and he had another child, this next child he also called Harriet Emma Lechmere, shows that he had must have had a very close bond towards those aunts. This is where Harriet Lechmere's grave is. This area is mostly desolate now. There's a few graves in this area. It's mostly desolate. Harriet Lechmere. She's on grave R5. Very easy to identify because you've got the R there and the 5's there, so that's easy find, that one was. The next grave I'm going to show you is that of another one of Charles Lechmere's children, George Lechmere. Hold on a second. Cross. No, that's nothing to do with it. George Lechmere, who died in a lunatic asylum because clearly madness ran in the family, and he died in 1914 and was buried before the First World War, was buried in April 1914 just here in grave P1120, which I can locate it because I can see the number on this grave here, but it was just in here, a common grave, P1120 for George Lechmere. This is George Lechmere's cemetery record for grave P1120. There are 8 other people in this grave, which was dug 18 feet deep. He died in March 1914. He was Charles Lechmere's 5th child. He was committed to London County Lunatic Asylum at Claybury and Woodford, northeast London, in 1907. Claybury was quite recently converted into a posh housing complex called Repton Park. This is George Lechmere's grave, P1120. As I said, he died in an insane asylum in 1914. There's only 2 1120 graves on the map, and the other one definitely isn't a P, so by deduction that one has to be the correct grave. I'm now going to show you the grave of Elizabeth Lechmere, maiden name Bostock, the wife of Charles Lechmere. She died in September 1940 during the war in hospital. She was quite old, 20 years after Charles Lechmere. She's in square 1. This is square 1, which is at the top northeast corner of the cemetery, quite a long way away from all the other Lechmere graves. Now, I had some confusion when I first tried to find this grave, because this one here is the Wiggins family, which is down on the maps and on the list as what is it, I-834, and the one next to it, which should have been her grave, which is 2374, is down here. There's a marker here and it's 5089. for this Ford family. And I solved the problem. I looked it up on their records within Tower Hamlets Cemetery's records. The Ford family, who were buried 1850s and 1860s, there's quite a few of them in there. Although it has this number, 5089, they've got two different numbers on the grave. The other number is the proper number, 2374, which is Elizabeth Lechmere's number. So I think she was buried during the war on top of their grave. This is Elizabeth Lechmere's cemetery record, the wife, showing grave P2374. She died in what was West Ham Workhouse in Leytonstone. It was renamed Central Home in 1930 as a home for the elderly. She was 91 when she died. And this is the Ford family grave record in the cemetery records, individually marked 5089, but the plot, as I said, is 2374. So this is Charles Lechmere's wife's grave, Elizabeth Lechmere, previously Bostock. That grave, 1940, which I believe was buried. She was buried in a different over the top of another private grave during the war. I mentioned earlier how this graveyard hadn't been kept up properly since the late Victorian period, and that continues. The disrespectful way the dead are treated, the way people have commented on my other videos how overgrown it is. It's quite nice for it to be a bit overgrown, it's a bit gothic, but this goes way beyond that. It's compared to the other magnificent 7 cemeteries, it's a total shambles, and they are still quite manicured, well cared for, and I think it's no coincidence they're in more affluent areas. Look at this big pile of gravestones here just piled up there, and if we walk over this way, there's some others that have been disrespectfully treated. This cemetery, as I've said several times, was going to be demolished in 1967. The last burials took place in the mid to late 50s, and no sooner the last burials took place than they wanted to demolish it because perhaps there's not as posh memorials here as there are some very grand memorials here, but by and large they're more humble ones, like those gravestones we just saw there. But they're still people, and they're still history in a different way. History isn't all about the grandees, and they've been treated in a totally disrespectful manner, and from the Victorian times up until present day. Their lives, look at this here, their lives are clearly not worth as much as other people's lives. We're in square 41 of the cemetery. We're looking for grave T421, which is roughly in this area. The fence of the cemetery, or the wall of the cemetery, used to be where that fence is, and over here you can see the prairie-like surroundings, which is as a result of the desecration of the cemetery by the GLC in 1967. Now, the grave here was the grave of Maria Fosdyke. She was buried in December 1902. Maria Fosdyke is Charles Lechmere's mother. I believe she played a very central part in his life, in influencing him in what he did, frankly. Now, Maria Fosdyke, she was into cat's meat. She had a big cat's meat business throughout the 1890s and probably a little bit before. She was a very, I believe, domineering woman. She married 3 times. She was originally Rolson. That was her maiden name. She married Charles Lechmere's father, John Allen Lechmere. She then bigamously married Thomas Cross, the policeman, whose grave we saw. When he died, he was about 10 years younger than her. When he died, she married Joseph Fosdyke, whose grave we also saw. He was about 10 years older than her. Then she had this successful cat's meat business, and she was buried in this vicinity here. And next, what's the next grave? What's the one grave we haven't seen? Well, it's very close to this grave, and I think that is significant as well. Maria Fosdyke, as she was at her death, she had previously been Maria Cross, and before that Maria Lechmere, before that Maria Ralston. She is in grave T421, as seen in this record. She died aged 77 in 1902. Her grave was also 18 feet deep and there were 7 other people in it. About 50 yards over there is the grave we just saw of Maria Fosdyke, Maria Cross as previously, Maria Lechmere before that, the mother of Charles Lechmere. And here, where I'm standing, in square 50, grave P1396, is where Charles Allen Lechmere was buried on the 31st of December 1920, New Year's Eve. He died about a week before. I can place it here because over here we have the graves that survived the desecration by the GLC in 1967. This is just inside the area which was smashed up. There's still a few bits of stone here. Don't bother coming and checking for them for names because there's no names on any of these. I already had a look. But this, where I'm standing, is the grave, in my opinion, the grave of Jack the Ripper. When Charles Lechmere's great-great-granddaughter revisited the cemetery 2 days after this film was made, she followed a crow all the way to Charles Lechmere's grave before it flew off. So this is the grave of Maria Fosdyke, previously Maria Cross, previously Maria Lechmere, born as Maria Ralston, T421. At the very southern part of the cemetery, all this area has been destroyed by the Great London Council in 1967. And very close by, just over here, is the grave of Charles Allen Lechmere, P1396, easily identifiable by these graves over here, which still exist. This is roughly the boundary of the area that saved destruction from the Great London Council. All this area has been ransacked and destroyed. These graves remain, which is how I can identify where Charles Lechmere's grave is to this day. Charles Lechmere's wife, Elizabeth, was buried at the very opposite end of the cemetery. Although it was 20 minutes later, I have no doubt that had his children asked or thought about it or thought it was appropriate, they could have arranged for a plot much closer to where their father and her husband had been buried. Charles Lechmere was buried in P1396 with 14 other people. 6 of them were children.